Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. Thank you for listening in to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and I am joined by Mastersmith Lin Rhea. Lin Rhea is an integral part of the blacksmithing and bladesmithing community, with a special focus towards heritage blacksmithing, and also is a large proponent and researcher for the history and documentation of James Black-style Bowie knives. Lin has spent a long time trying to research and develop methods for identification of Bowie knives and their origins. And it's an extreme pleasure to get to talk to you today, Lin. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure entirely. I think probably the first thing I will admit is that for the longest time, I thought that your last name was pronounced Rhea instead of Ray. And I was doing a little bit of research on surnames for Ray, and I found that there's like two primary origins. One is with the Scottish culture, and the other is with Greek. Can you tell me which way it leans? Are you one of Scottish heritage or Greek?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know really. We in our family lore we go to Scotland, so really not sure if the actual name is anything other than Scottish. I have heard those other origins as well mentioned to me, but I just don't know.
That's really fascinating to me because in my research, I was looking back at the the lineage of that name, and it goes back to before the Middle Ages in Scottish history, and one of the oldest forms of names from the Pict people back there. So I think that's a very fascinating component of your history.
It does to us too. I mean, that's the same understanding we have as well, but we have not deeply gone back into the history to see what the true origins, or we haven't done any DNA searches yet, but we plan on it.
So talk to me a little bit about your origins. I've read little snippets about your life here and there, but I'm just interested to know a little bit more about who you are outside of knives, and then we'll get into your knife making journey, if that's okay.
That is fine. Yes. Well, I was born here in Arkansas, not far from where I sit right now in central Arkansas, and was raised my whole life around here. And I've been an outdoors person, fishing, hunting, raised in what I consider a very good, close family. I've got two older sisters who are both deceased, and I've got two younger brothers who are really close in age, so we was all kind of partners in crime throughout our life and still remain close. And I've got four kids, and they're all grown, with some with kids of their own. So that kind of set me up for being interested in knives. I've always been really, really interested in a good knife, good quality guns and knives. An outdoors person, they thrive on that kind of thing. So yeah, I went to the school down there in Washington, Arkansas, and took my first class in 2002 at my wife's suggestion and prodding. I explained to her that I really wanted to make a good knife, and I was trying to make some knives, but they weren't too good. I didn't really know what I was doing. I needed to go get some basics. So then I started taking classes, and I took a class every year or so for several years, and took to it really well. And before I knew it, I was going to shows and had my table and things like that. So sort of fell into it.
That's cool. I I think that probably for me that the same thing kind of happened, although, I'm still in the earlier stages of my knife making journey. I think I've been in it 7 years now. But originally, I would hunt for like the Texas usual, like whitetail, hog, and I got selected for a draw hunt in South Texas for nilgai. I don't know if you're familiar with the Indian antelope, but
Yeah, yeah, I know what it is. Yeah,
yeah. So for listeners, I believe it was the early 1900s. The nilgai was a gift from royalty in India to the King Ranch down in the South Texas area. And a few of them had passed because they were acclimated to the temperatures. But then I believe that the King Ranch shipped a bunch more over from India, and now they've kind of proliferated in the South Texas area. But they are kind of like a mix between a cow and an antelope. So they're very large. So the bulls can get to 800-900 pounds, and they're trophy animals. But they taste really good, and they're interesting to hunt, and they have horns and things like that can be used in knives. So for the sake of covering that, but what happened was I was every time I was hunting, I would end up having dull knives, because it was just like 440C or whatever. I mean, it wasn't. They were manufactured stamped out knives, and the heat treating was not great. And I found that on bigger game, it was just very arduous to try to get from the start to the finish on a single deer or whatever, and still have a sharp knife. And that really bugged me, especially on a 300-pound cow nilgai. And so I was like, I got to do something different. So I don't know why I didn't just buy a custom knife, because this adventure has been, a costly investment in learning knives, but I've enjoyed it along the way. But it comes from like a deep desire to make a good knife, because it just felt like at least what you could buy at the time was just not really great.
yeah, I agree. Same with me. I too had a deep desire to have a good knife, but unfortunately, I couldn't always afford a good knife. I'd somehow acquire them. I'd buy, of course, a lot of them, and I found some in the woods. People left behind accidentally, dropped it or something, and I'd end up making a sheath for it. And I still have a lot of those knives from childhood, but I too wanted to have a knife that would hold an edge and that would be a real tool and not just a novelty or just something that was disposable. I don't like the whole idea of disposable. Uh, and I'm not talking about the ones you replace the blades. I'm talking about the ones that are so cheap. You use them a few times, and if you lose it, you don't lose any sleep at all over it. You just go buy another one. That's the kind I'm talking about. I wanted a good knife, one that you value like you would your firearm or your truck. You take care of them.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And it's interesting how many parallels there are between us, because like my early exposure to knives, like I always feel like growing up, because I grew up in the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania, and I feel like the culture was like everybody had a knife. Like both of my grandparents were in World War II. They always had pocket knives, either a lockback or a slip joint, some fixed blades. And I feel like it was just, you have knives everywhere. And an early example was my grandparents found I think it was a Camelus slip joint. It was like a muskrat, and like a 2-bladed trapper, and gave it to me when I was like 6 or 7. Once I could finally open that thing, because I was breaking off my nails and everything on it, and they found it and gave it to me, and I thought that was really cool. And from an early age, Bowie knives had always interested me, because I grew up in like I grew up in an area that was like, I don't know, set back in time quite a ways. And I mean, for anybody who lives in rural areas, sometimes that can happen, where it just feels like the scene is much older than current day. Like it felt like I was growing up in the 50s and 60s at times, especially because the area was impoverished. And so I watched a lot of my uncle, great uncle, would record on the Disney Channel all the old Davy Crockett movies and Zorro and things like that. And so like the Alamo and Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett in the pioneer era all fascinated me. And that was one thing that got me really interested in Bowie's, even being up north so far. And so I think like for me, I've always really admired the art form, and that's a large impetus for wanting to have you on the show. Is I just feel that you are the quintessential Bowie man, like and from a history perspective and everything. So I'd like to actually start asking you more questions so we can get into that more. But what got you from the phase of doing like just knife making in general to really zeroing in on Bowie knives and Bowie history?
Good question. Well, I started participating in cutting competitions early on, not long after I started making knives. And so those are naturally going to be larger knives. But since I too am a Bowie fan, I didn't want to go to the cleaver style or the way some of the competitors were going toward the cleavers and kind of steering away from a cross guard and a sharp clip, which Bowies have. They were going more to the guardless and the chopped off front end on the blade, and more like a race knife, as if I had to describe it. I wanted to stay with tradition. I'm a traditional person. I like muzzle loading. I like the whole idea of, everything from BB guns to slingshots to firearms, everything traditional. Uh, I enjoy. But what really, I think there's two other things that boosted me towards that way. Another thing is I started working at that historic museum, Historic Arkansas Museum. And of course, Bowie knives, that's when I was right in the middle of it. I fell into a place that I couldn't have been in a better spot to be learning about the history of the Bowie knife, the stories and legends and accounts. Literally, I could read, go to the archives or to the library. Um, and they have a library there, believe it or not, a really good, well stocked library at the Historic Arkansas Museum, and I had access to it, so I could learn all about the historical aspects of the knife. I loved that part of it. But they also were training me to be a historic blacksmith. So uh, my whole uh, my whole mind and fields of interest were steered towards the historic side of things. So um, and the traditional ways of getting there. If I'm going to make a knife, I want to forge it, uh, which I had already been forging blades due to going to the school, the ABS school. But when I started learning historic blacksmithing, then uh, I started understanding historic techniques better and learning to use the historic um, coal forge and the tools that the common blacksmith had back in the 1800s. I started understanding those things. So I guess what it did is just sort of got my mind to thinking in that direction, and so it could not have. Uh, I guess it was just inevitable that it was going to change the way I make knives. It was going to change the look and style of my work. And people commented on that. And when you're in the moment and you're working over a period of time, you may not notice that there's changes taking place yourself, but other people see it because they're standing back looking at it objectively. And so that started making me not just notice it, but I started consciously directing it that way, and so it works for me, and so now I'm really encouraging other people to do it. I'm to the point of irritation, probably. I am trying to get people that forge to forge more, to forge close, to study the historic aspects of it. So, yeah, I did. It wasn't conscious that I would at first go that direction, but now that I have, I want to share it because I think it helps a person to have more options. It helps them develop a style a little bit easier, uh, and that's really it in a nutshell. Is those influences uh, that I was uh, approached with and around. Those are what kind of steered me toward the historic side and the Bowie traditional Bowie shape.
I find that fascinating. Your exposure into blacksmithing and everything, and I think for me, it's quintessentially heritage, right? If you think about blacksmithing being one of the early staples of a community, and that like forge to finish and tolerance was one of the core tenets of blacksmithing, because we didn't have the same kind of grinders and everything like that we have today. That um, it pulls very deep from blacksmithing roots from ancient times, and I appreciate, and I think I've always appreciated that you make an incredible knife that you hardly have to touch with a grinder. And if more artisans and bladesmiths and everything were to adopt that kind of mentality, I just think that the quality of work and the reliance on grinders and stock removal to get to the final form would, like, that paradigm would change a little bit. But I think that there's kind of a safety net with blacksmithing and the introduction to the craft, where it's like, if I can't really bladesmith something, then I can always grind it out in post production, I guess.
Yeah, there's a thought that occurs to me a lot these days, and I try to enact it, of course, myself, but I try to explain my feelings about this thought to others, and that is, whereas today in the modern blacksmith shop or knife maker shop, we we are being pulled by the necessity. We're trying to make money. Time is money. Those kind of thinking, those kind of thoughts are overriding. Um, and so we buy the next greatest tool, the next thing that saves us time, saves us effort, speeds our process up. So in that way, we give ourselves a raise, so to speak, because we can do it with less effort, more, more saving more time. Uh, but I kind of went the other way for this reason, and this is has to do with that thought that I am an integral part of this process. The maker must be the most important part of the process. So if I choose my projects or create a project or a design that in which I must be the most necessary part of the process, then it will elevate my skills. It will cause me to be a more important play a more important role in this process. So whereas sometimes time, I must consider the time factor. I got to get this done because I got the show. I got to leave in the morning, so to speak. For example, uh, and that happens. Uh, but generally speaking, if I take responsibility myself as being the most important part of this process, the most important tool. Um, it's my skill level. If I can't do it, it's not going to get done. I can't rely on a machine, a CNC, a mill, or any other set of modern equipment, tools, grinders, etc. I have to do this myself, or it's not going to happen. This process, uh, I'm thinking at that time, at that moment, I'm thinking this process requires me to do my part. Um, and that's what keeps coming to me. This thought and this idea and this responsibility, sense of responsibility, comes to me whenever I'm working the way I do here with a coal fire. I've got a historic anvil, uh, a Peter Wright vise, and it's it just directs your mind back in time, and you sort of take on the persona and play the part. So, well, I don't forget what year we're in or anything like that. I'm just saying I feel a connection to those Smiths back in the 1800s, early 1800s, because I'm doing things the way they done it, and I feel that connection, and I think it makes me a better Smith.
Well, yeah, I agree because in my own knife making experience, it is really hard to navigate knife making. There's just so many different ways that you can get into it, so many different paths that you can follow, and I think what I've discovered in my conversations with others is that there's usually some point in time when a knife maker actually gets past the rudiments of how to make a knife and into the what makes me the knife maker, what makes the work a representation of my desires versus just, I don't know, where you can take a pattern that somebody else has made and replicate it, and it's that pattern, but what is me, right? And I think that there's not a lot of clarity in what paths a maker takes. And I'll use it for instance. I've thought about my own mortality quite a bit in my knife shop. I've invested all this money in equipment and materials and things, and I think about what I'm creating for my wife and for my kids and everything if something should happen to me. And the reality is, what I've created is a lot of equipment that they'll have to sell off to recoup whatever I've invested in it, and that it pretty much stops with me. Like there is in knife making, especially in a lot of crafts, I feel is like it is a single, like a sole proprietorship, and there is no, unless the kids are really interested in carrying on the craft holistically, it pretty much stops with the maker. And because of that, I've thought a lot about how does knife making from a philosophy diverge. And I think that one path you take is you accept the fact that your knife making is a sole proprietorship, that you are the only one that will impart what you have to bring to the world on your knives. And the other is that you can go the production route or the business route for knives, where everything is lather, rinse, repeat. It's about repeatability, production, and the margin that you get on your blade. One way I feel like you go down, it is really about pushing your craft and your aesthetic and the things that you really care about in your work, like the same way as a painter might paint a certain thing. And then the other is, I'm making live, laugh, love placards to sell on Etsy or whatever for however much that costs and however quickly I can produce it. And I wish that was clearer earlier on for knife makers, because I really think that there's a fork in the road, and you have to decide: are you going to push yourself in your craft? Are you going to go production and worry about the business of knives, or are you going to fizzle out because you don't know what you're going to do and you don't really care anymore? And I think that that's kind of what it comes down to. Like, what I've discovered is really there are really two paths. It's either you do it for a business and you try to make you whatever margin you can, or you do it because you love the craft and because you're just trying to create something that is uniquely you.
Yes. The way I would, the realization that came to me when it came, uh, I describe it like this. Um, it's like a chef as opposed to a cook. A cook can take someone else's recipe and imitate that or use it, follow it, and do okay. But sooner or later, they're still just a cook. I mean, you have to realize that they're doing other people's um, work. They're following other people's recipe. But a chef can take the flavors and textures and the different techniques and mix and match and put together a new recipe. I mean, actually create. So being creative is what I think is the goal of the other fork in the road that you alluded to is can you be creative? Can you actually innovate and create? Can you? And there's so many ways of doing that. I mean, there's no end to it. I've heard people say this: everything has been done, and we just are rediscovering. Well, that's true a lot of the times, but um, there's still room for creativity, and a lot of it. There's plenty of room for that, and it just so happens my choice for borrowing techniques is from the old masters from the early days. A lot of things that's been forgotten uh, are being rediscovered. Yes, rediscovered, but in some sense, we're that open mind and looking back and not having everything spelled out ABC, paint by number. There's freedom to it. There's a certain amount of freedom to it, and you can be creative. You're not limited. You haven't been corrupted by an established pattern. Uh, and I use that term loosely, corrupted. I hope you know I don't mean that uh, very strictly, but uh, it just means you have the freedom to create. And because most of the time when we refrain from trying something, it's because we've been programmed not to. That's not going to work. That's not good. That's not uh, acceptable. Um, but if someone doesn't try it, they don't know it can be done. You know, it can be done. So I've spent a lot of my career trying things, attempting things, and yeah, I failed a few times, and some things I probably realized that is a failure. It's not going to work. That's a bad idea. But some of my ideas work. Crazy, some of them. It seems crazy, and I like to laugh about it because I get a lot of comments to that effect. It's goofy, That's uh, it's hilarious to me, but someone has to try these things. But uh, kind of back to the point, uh, it's important to create and be creative. So you got to loosen yourself from some of those uh, patterns that you've been programmed into thinking, ways to think. And in knife making, there's a lot of that. There's a lot of those pre-programmed thinking thoughts that we have to kind of get around to be creative.
Yeah. Yeah. And um, again, I think it comes kind of down to the philosophy, right? I mean, and this, I try to make a point of mentioning that knives is much about philosophy and your mentality on how you do knives as it is the actual technique of doing it. But I'm reminded, Laren Thomas's book on Damascus and metals in history, right? I had him on the podcast a few episodes ago. We were talking about his book, and he has a large section that's dedicated to the history of Damascus, right? And pattern welded steels. And there's a common theme where there's somebody who understands that there is some point in time in history that this thing had been like done-ish, right? With woots and everything like that. And then you have this convergence of a ton of people that have developed out individual techniques for how to get from that ancient, forgotten method to where we're at today. But if we think about that, the butterfly effect of that passion towards revitalizing pattern welded or Damascus steel has really introduced the modern knife collector and knife user to knives in a way that I don't know if it was present as much in the 1970s. Like everybody I know knows what a Damascus blade is. Like if you talk about a knife, they want they have an idea about forged in fire or the forged technique, and they think that the pinnacle of that is a Damascus blade. And I think that as we've traveled down this road of revitalizing bladesmithing inside of metalworking, that a lot of people now that's the first thought that they think of. They think that a blade should be a forged blade, or it's the perception of value is that it's a forged blade, and Damascus is like the higher end or higher art form of bladesmithing. And I just have to wonder if it wasn't for a bunch of people getting together and trying to figure out Damascus, what would the landscape of knives look like today? And that's kind of interesting to me, how one passion and one focus leads to a resurgence or a repopularization of artistry and what it's done to our knife industry holistically.
Yes, it definitely created a new palette, if you will, for art. Just the blade itself, or the material itself that the knife is made from, it can have within it its own art, its own set of geometric patterns and colors and textures, and so it's just another level in which that creates interest in knives. Damascus or pattern welded steel is certainly another tool in which the knife maker can take advantage of to create interest. It's wonderful. It really is wonderful, but it's not, in my view, it's not of itself what knife making might be about. Form and function takes precedent, in my opinion. Yet, I do make Damascus, and I like it. But I still say that the form and function takes precedent over that material. Just my thinking.
No, I mean, but that's. I was thinking back a few questions where you were talking about where we're talking about heritage, right? And I think that if we really think about the role that blacksmiths in general held in society, it's very utilitarian, right? I mean, even like from pioneer days, we're talking about wagon wheels and pitchforks and shovels. I mean, whatever. Everything was utilitarian, and the value system was different, right? I mean, blacksmiths, if they were getting paid a wage, it was either as somewhat in like a tender, like money, or it was in barter. And I think that the value system has changed over time to purely bartering, or purely currency, right? But back in the day, you could make something and trade, I don't know, like something else for it, and the value of a person's time was intrinsic to what they could trade that time for to survive, right? And to me, utility always comes first in tools, because if it doesn't function, if it doesn't conform to the requirements of utility first, then I think that it loses its intrinsic value. Even though something like an art knife looks really good, if it's an art knife that's band-aided together, like at the core of it, it doesn't actually function, then it doesn't hold the same value as something that is well built and is it's just pushing that envelope of art.
Yes, I do agree with that, and my leanings, of course, are toward the practical. In fact, it's been impressed upon me over the years of training as a historic blacksmith that practicality was their guide. It was the watchword, because uh, they weren't, while they cared how it looked. Yeah, sure, there's some more artists, and when you look at individual pieces of work, you can tell that this blacksmith cared more about the artistic aspect of this piece, whereas you look at another one of the same tool, same piece of hardware, whatever it is. Uh, this one cared more about the practical aspects of it, and it's very utilitarian in its form, but it functions just fine. So that's individual choice, and I have my I have my preferences. Even though I may not make a knife, one particular knife out of Damascus steel, it must, you know, there has to be some uh, pride in the way it looks. I'm going to be. I've got my particulars about how it looks. I'm going to be very, very careful. Line and flow is everything to me, and uh, that's that's very, very important because it's ergonomic. The term form follows function means something. Uh, you can't go so practical, so um, utilitarian that it's no longer important how it looks. I draw a line there. It's got to look good too.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a blacksmith. He made blades too, but he was a blacksmith up in North Texas area, and his name was Will Frary. And he was talking to me early on when I was thinking about getting more into forge work about what he would consider sacred geometry, or the function of cubits and proportion, right? So, and we can follow that all the way back to ancient Egyptian times, where cubits, well, in biblical times too, but cubits were the measure of your appendages and how that relates to function, because it follows a natural geometric sequence that feels natural, that has utility inside of nature. And I've often thought about that, as I look at your work, there is something that is very pleasing to me in your proportions and in the way that you execute your lines. And I'm not talking about grind lines and everything. I'm talking about the holistic proportion and aesthetic of your blades. I don't know what it is exactly about it that just appeals so intrinsically to me. I look at your knives and I'm like, that is absolutely what I would consider the way that a blade should look. And I can't really put a like I guess if we measured out your work and did analysis on what you're creating, we would probably find that there is a similarity to some geometric proportion in it. But I really honestly don't know if we think about the science of knives and the geometrical component of things as much from a science perspective yet. But again, it looks very pleasing to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I believe that we can assign numbers and ratios and equations to these things, and they they do for sure apply. They do, but it's a start. It's just a start of something deeper. And what's deeper, in my opinion, is the emotional attraction that it has. Which it's in our DNA to be attracted to certain forms and proportions. So um, we we just know, and I'm not trying to be too simplistic about it, but it's that emotional attraction, or the what I would like to do when I make a knife is to evoke emotion. Now it may be different from knife to knife, but and some some of them are not very do, don't evoke much emotion. I got to admit that. I mean, every now and then you're going to have something you're not so happy with, but that's the goal. That is the goal. And the more that the time you spend, the more that you apply your you invest your emotion, your time, your effort, and you go that extra mile to make this as pretty and all the curves just right. They complement one another. You don't all of a sudden you got all these curves, and then there's a straight line that just catches your eye that don't belong. um, I go to the effort to get it all as close to right as I possibly can. That's to my satisfaction. I do it because that's the way I want it. I want that to represent my work. uh, so yeah, those proportions are very, very important. And but things that are, unless you're building say a building that is actually kind of rectangular, and all the doors are certain proportion, the windows are proportion, they're all rectangular, they have square corners. Our knives are not made like that. They're all curved, they all have gaining uh, gaining shapes that accelerate as it covers uh, space. And you can look at a blade that is forward heavy. If all the curves and lines are correct, it looks good. Then you can have a long, sleek blade that is very light toward the tip, getting narrower, tapered, graceful. That also looks good. So, proportion, yeah, it plays a part, big part, sure does. Um, but those two knives have different purposes. They do. One would be a fighter, or the thin, long, thin one with a nice taper to it, lighter in the front, would be more of a fighter. I'm saying it's leaning that way. The other one would be more of a chopper or a Bowie. Um, they're both just equally beautiful, but they have different shapes, and it's all because the combination of those proportions and curves. If the curves don't complement one another, then it will snag your eye. That's the way I describe it. My eye goes there, and I can't get away from it, and it's just not. It's just not as good as it could be. So I believe in making it as good as it could be.
Yeah. Well, I in your work, I I honestly think that if I want to talk about a quintessential piece that you make that shows or exhibits your craft as a master bladesmith. And what that really means is your X-ray Bowie. So we take this a design concept of the Bowie knife, and we turn this into an exhibition of how far you can push proportion and utilitarianism in building an integral knife the way that you do with the X-ray. And I'd like you to explain to our listeners exactly what the process is of building your X-ray knife out. And I think that we can talk a little bit more about why that is so exceptional for you to make as a craftsman, and how that elevates your work to mastery.
Okay, I'll do my best. First of all, I set myself a very stringent limit. For me to be, I mentioned earlier, for me to be the integral part of this process, uh, then I have to limit myself to other factors. Uh, so I set myself as a limiting factor one material, only one material. I allowed myself that. And so for me to make a knife that's comfortable, usable, functional, and on par as far as its function and usability with any other standard knife that we might make or buy, um, for me to do that with one material, that means I'm going to have to really go to some uh, extreme geometry changes when I'm forging. So, and on top of that, I've got to maintain a good balance in the knife, literal balance as well as visual balance. Um, uh, that's a hard one for me to explain, visual balance, but uh, it has to have uh, not just proportion and profile. Profile is pretty easy to explain and easy to see. That's the first thing we see, but uh, visual balance. Let me try this. The combination of profile along with proportion, the open area and the solid area, uh, those are proportionate too. They provide visual balance. You see knives that are busy. They have so much going on the blade. Let's just say it. I'll describe something I think is busy. A Damascus blade, fully engraved guard and handle. Then you've got burl wood and lots of. It maybe have some jewels encrusted in parts of it, but there's so much going on that becomes busy. In my opinion, I want very few elements in a knife, and when I provide those few elements sufficiently, then I say that's good. That's enough. That is what pleases the eye. And I describe it like this: it's the black dress on a beautiful woman. She doesn't need a lot of makeup or jewelry or anything. She's beautiful, dressed simply. If you see what I'm saying. Um, so a knife is that way. You provide the few basic elements, do them well, do them well, and then it's a thing of beauty. Uh, Now, let's go back to the X-ray and how can one piece of steel? How can I impart beauty to that? Well, that might be a matter of opinion, just like a lot of other things. Um, but you can see that I have at least tried to uh, give that knife proportion, flow, and of course, when you hold it, then you know whether it's got balance or not. I mean, you feel it with your hand. Does it have hot spots? Is it rough? Or does it feel like a real knife? I mean, in your hand. So I'm having to answer all those checkpoints, uh, answer all those questions, and check off all those boxes. So when I'm doing all that, with something with so limited of material, it requires so much of me. Uh, well, that's a difficult thing to do, and I it took me a while. I mean, it really did. I didn't even know what questions to ask of myself. I just knew that I was fixing to learn something. And it was going to take me a while. So, yeah, I had quite a scrap pile built up uh, and made several mistakes. But when I started seeing it coming together, I also started seeing improvements and some also improvements in my process. I had to create a process to make that thing because if I couldn't repeat it, it was just an accident that I made the first, made a good one. Well, that's not really an accomplishment. I had to really create a process that someone else could learn and repeat, and the results were predictable. So um, that's that's a real challenge. I can't tell you how much of a challenge it was, but I was pretty stubborn and determined to do it. So I don't know if I've even touched on the real question yet, Aaron, but I'd sure like to expound on it if you can help me.
Yeah, well, I think it's important for everybody to understand that the concept of the X-ray knife is to take a small piece of steel and through a series of processes elongate, fold, and shape the blade to be a fully integral knife from a single material and a single piece of material. And so, Lynn, what is the dimension? So, if we're talking about a Bowie knife, what is the starting point with that piece of steel? Like, how many inches by how many inches? Like, what's the mass on it and everything?
Okay, that's a good question. For say a 10-inch blade and overall about 15 and a quarter, handle included, um, the starting point or material would be about 2 and 1/4 inch wide by 5/16 thick by about 10 inches long. 4 inches of that material would be the handle, and the 6 inches would be the blade. And it all has to be, the geometry has to be extremely changed. And I start with the handle first because it's the most difficult thing to make those extreme geometry changes. And uh, and after I'm happy that this handle this handle band that goes straight out, I just leave it straight. I don't make the bends until I forge the blade, and then I make the bends. Uh, so that process, of course, that's a very elementary way of describing the process, but um, it can be scaled up or down. So you can make a bigger knife by going with just a little bit bigger starting material. You can make a smaller knife by just scaling it down, but it's all proportionate. So you want a smaller knife? I would say 2 inch wide instead of 2 and a quarter, and a 1/4 inch thick instead of 5/16, and 8 inches long instead of 10 inches long. You follow what I'm saying? So you just scale things down or up depending on the size of the knife that you want to end up with.
Yeah, and I think a pause point here is everybody listening. You can look on Lynn's Instagram and see an illustration of the basic concepts by, I believe, Jeff Fetter had illustrated that in watercolor, right? The process for you.
Yeah. Now he illustrated the small hunting knife shape, that style knife, the X-ray hunter. That's a small one, and I'd say the maximum length on that would be about 8.5, 9 inches. Blade's probably 4 inches, 4.5 maybe. That drawing applies to a smaller knife. So, but the big X-ray, I have videos on YouTube uh, that I describe the process and show and share some of the steps and stages of it. I believe you could make that knife using the X-ray, or excuse me, using the YouTube videos that I have out.
Yeah. Well, so it's hard. It's hard when we take these. Like I've done a lot of research on you and your work, and you've obviously spent a lifetime perfecting this craft. And for the average listener who doesn't know a lot about your work, it's hard to describe exactly how magnificent the X-ray concept is. But for the sake of argument, it's really hard. Like you've taken a concept in forging and it's really cheeky. And I think that's probably the reason why I like the X-ray is because there's a certain level of ridiculous comedy that is in taking all of these constraints. Like you've basically given yourself every possible handicap that you could possibly give yourself, apart from not having an anvil, a hammer, and a fire to make a blade. You're talking about such a small piece of material that you then have to elongate and shift in so many ways and still make a functional knife. And I think that that's probably if I look at what like you make very beautiful blades, and all things fair and equal. I think that those will go down in history as being quintessentially you. But if ever anybody is ever looking at what your magnum opus concept is, it really is the X-ray. And maybe I'm speaking out of turn a little bit here, but it's when you reach a level of mastery where you say, like let's play with this. I want to see if I can actually do this with taking a single material type, a single piece of something, and turning it into a fully functional blade, and also making it beautiful, and also conforming to all of the traditional concepts of proportion, and having to deal with all of the chaos associated with quenching it and moving it around and everything. Like all of those elements, for you to be able to pull off a finished X-ray knife, to me, shows a level of mastery that it can only be described as comical. Like it's like so far beyond the normal purview of knife making.
Well, thank you for that. And actually, what I'm really wanting to do with this is to show the extremes that steel and iron can be moved. The old masters could do it. They could do it. I was trained by. I'm gonna drop a name here. I hope you don't mind. I was trained historically by Peter Ross. Um he was the master of the shop at Colonial Williamsburg for a number of years, and as good as he is, and I hold him in very high esteem as far as moving metal. Uh, he told me that if someone picked him up and dropped him into the 17th and 18th, 19th century, he would just be mediocre as a smith. Uh, Now, as high as I hold him in regard, uh, some of the old masters were better at moving material. Now we've all heard of Samuel Yellen, Philadelphia acclaim, and some of the metal artistry that he is responsible for on some of the architecture around Philadelphia. Um, Now he could do these things at will and repeat these things. Uh, but I guess what my point would be with making the X-ray is that as modern knife makers that claim to forge, do we do as much or as little as possible? Can we be more responsible in our forging, or can we try to be what I consider to be immature in our forging, and do as little as possible and rely on other mechanisms, machinery, uh, and equipment, modern tooling, to do the work that we should be doing. And of course, I know that everything has its exceptions. We maybe have our limitations, whether we live in the country or downtown in a big city. We cannot take advantage of coal forging, and I'm speaking of it as if that's a big plus. It is to me, but other people's opinion may differ on that. But um, I believe um, that again we have to take responsibility, and if we are wanting to be good smiths, we have to get out there and practice. We have to uh, we have to create projects that require more from us. And yes, that takes time and a hard work. And it's hard to do that because we're actually in training, and it's a difficult thing to really explain. But that's just my goal, is to show what's possible and encourage others to do it.
Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate that. I think that whenever I've talked to you, I feel like we always end up talking a lot about philosophy in knives, and we don't live in an era of tribal knowledge as much as we used to, right? Like since I think the modern era of communication and the internet, you find more and more that society takes information for granted. And a perfect example is there are lots of things in this world that I don't feel that I, as a parent, have equipped my children to do because I've made it really easy on them. And for whatever faults there are in parenting, I guess I won't be too apologetic in providing a life for my children that is unfettered by poverty and difficulty the same way that I grew up. But my children have access to information at their fingertips if they have the drive to actually ask those questions and to delve into it, and they don't need to have somebody else do it for them. But I often have to tell them, hey, you're like, do you want to understand the concepts of how oil is changed, or how to cook something a little bit more complex, or I don't know, how taxes work, or how to balance a checkbook, or things like that. Yeah, I could teach them each one of those things, but they have so much information available to them that if they spent their entire life just learning the random facts that they can on the internet, and qualifying that with a little experience from like a person, that they really wouldn't need a lot of tribal knowledge. They could rely almost holistically on the written and documented word in order to be able to create things. And I think in some ways that's where we're at as a society. And it also trickles down into knives, where it's not like it used to be in knife making and the craft of blacksmithing, where you had to figure out everything by yourself. And so the natural question mark around creation and creating things is something that you have to discover for yourself. But you can read other people's interpretation of what creation is. And I think in a lot of ways we take that for granted, that there's so much information out there that we stop seeking just because we feel like the answer has already been found. And I feel like what you're saying is that you do have to take responsibility for your own knowledge and for your own experiences in life, because that's your personal responsibility. That is the way that you ground yourself to a reality that is natural instead of interpretive from somebody else, right? And you have to be able to seek that out for yourself. and play with it. Otherwise, how do you know that something is real versus a simulation, or truth versus a lie? And that's it. I can interpret that as being not only applicable in life, but very specifically in knives, because so many people now just go the route of creating things because it's been done and it's repeatable and they don't have to think too much, versus really just having to ask hard questions for themselves.
Yeah, I see. I agree. I agree with that. But there's still things. Uh, there's still things to be discovered, and that's what my message is. Is while there's a lots and lots of information online, and even on YouTube and in books and whatever, lots and lots of information out there. But I still say there's more discoveries to be made, and we're all unique. We're individuals, and our taste and our artistry, it may be subdued and hidden inside of us, but can we tap into it? Can we make it grow? Can we make it thrive? And I'd say the only way we can do that is give it an opportunity. We can find a medium, and mine, of course, is knife making, smithing. Um, find a medium and explore what's possible and see what we can do. Uh, and can we make it our own? I would want my children to know that. And that's the message I have for them: is you have it in you. Just make it thrive. Cultivate it, watch it grow.
Yeah, and I think that we get cocky with thinking that everything is documented on the internet. And a perfect example of that, and kind of a segue into the next area I want to talk about, is Neil Punchard and I have become friends over the last few months, especially me launching this podcast and talking through things. And I actually had him on as a guest. And he and I were talking about the historical side of pocket knives, and the fact that there are references that he has to the historic representation of pocket knives that you would never find on the internet because nothing's been documented. They're all in like ephemera, like magazines or articles of some sort, or obtuse references, and the actual physical representation of those pocket knives in the form of a collection. And we were talking about that, and also his relationship with Mark Zaleski of Knife Magazine, and trying to make sure that that is documented in some form. And his form has been trying to bring that to print, as well as his historical representation in the Catch Bit Show podcast. But the segue into that is, I'm aware that you and Mark are part of a consortium for the historical representation of Bowie knives, and specifically the origins and the cultivation of what the historic record shows for Bowie knives. And can you talk a little bit more about what you guys are doing, and also the reopening of the museum in Arkansas, and a little bit. I know that's a kind of a compound question, but I kind of want to first talk about what you guys are doing with Mark and this consortium, and then I think that we could step into the museum and how that kind of represents that work.
Okay. Um, Mark and I, along with a few select others that are deeply interested in uh, these knives and how they're made, and what we really want to do is to create a database by which um, some of these knives can be um, authenticated. So we are gathering information of certain genre of knives. Say, let's just say, for instance, coffin handle Bowie knives, and of course James Black being sort of the center of that subject. Um, Coffin handle Bowie knives. So we what we want to do is create a database by which we can compare knives that are discovered or that comes from people's collections, their attics, um, their family estates. Um, they show up, and can we authenticate that knife as being uh, what it being an authentic James Black knife? Let's say, um, and there's hardly an end to the different antique knives genres or subgenres, I suppose, subcategories. You've got the California knives, you've got the Louisiana knives, you've got the one ofs, the made by blacksmiths, uh, and you've got the Sheffield knives, as we mentioned earlier, knives from New York, Philadelphia, different parts of this country, as well as uh, Sheffield. Let's just say Sheffield. There's a bunch, but let's just stop there. Um, what we're trying to do is by observation and testing, we're trying to gather data and get it written down. So if we know, let's just say we know a little bit about James Black's work, we are gathering data on his uh, common features of between the knives. Now he didn't have a big body of work, um, so uh, it's his work is it's often copied, but and it's often counterfeited. Um, but what we want to do is be able to say a particular knife, yes, that we think that's authentic, or we think that one is a reproduction that is made to look like James Black's work. Um, so this takes time. This is going to take time, and we're kind of getting started on that. And we're going to have a talk and a discussion, question and answer this coming Saturday at the Historic Arkansas Museum, in which Mark and myself and a couple of others are going to be answering questions. And one of the things that we want to stress and emphasize is that as knives become collectible, their value goes up, and the possibility that they're going to be uh, counterfeited or faked for nefarious reasons, that possibility increases as well. So we, as a knife maker, from my perspective, um, I want to share my views on what a knife maker can do to prevent that from happening with his work. Say, for instance, I'm making a reproduction uh, James Black style knife. Excuse me. What can I do to ensure that that knife will never be uh, passed off as an authentic James Black knife? So those are kind of things we're going to talk about. Um, in our testing, we're doing lots of different things. It's non-destructive, of course, testing to just gather the information that we need, the basic information. What's this material made? What is this part made of? Does it fit within the decade that it purports to have been made? Um, from what we know about the material from that time period, does it fit within that? Can it be authentic? And if we get enough facts and enough information, then we check off enough boxes, um, then we can authenticate it or not. So does that kind of help you to understand a little bit about what we're doing? I'd be glad to try to answer more questions, of course.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, uh, if anybody grew up in the era of Antiques Roadshow, they would know that there's anecdotal evidence or family history of things collected, and then there is the references, certificates of authenticity or whatever that establishes provenance
Yeah.
to a piece. And what you're trying to do is be able to, in some way, use evidences to build a provenance around James Black's work, and to also establish hallmarks, so that way there's some sort of trail to be able to associate a value with a finding, right? Because I mean, I really appreciate the fact that you guys are doing that, because I don't feel that that is being done with Bowie knives by anybody else in the world. And I might be naive in that sense, but there is no one right now. Like, I'm going to take a step back and say, I don't know that there's a lot of people that really understand the difference between the historical reference and origin of the Bowie knife in comparison to all of the conjecture and lore that has occurred with the Bowie knife to date. And so what you guys have done is, I think in the modern lexicon of knife making, it's been pretty well established where the Bowie knife originated, how it was used, James Black as the original blacksmith, and a certain number of pieces that represent his work and where that came from. But now you're taking it a step further and saying, for all other knives, Bowie-esque knives, in that period or after, this is a reference point for us to be able to provide provenance, so that way collectors are not getting scammed, as well as being able to provide historical reference that we just otherwise wouldn't have had if you guys didn't collect it.
Yes, it's there's several levels of conversation on this subject. Several. The value is, to me, the value of those knives are, it's interesting to me, but they're out of my reach. So I have to push that aside and think more about how its construction uh, is, and what techniques that either Mr. Black or whoever made this knife. And those are, we find commonalities between them. So if we suspect that we have two or three knives made by the same maker, is there anything in common with them? Those are the first things we ask, and we observe, and we answer that question. Then we start looking at the materials. Are they the same materials? Do we have any documentation on that maker? Did he have uh, any leanings toward using certain materials? If he did, are these materials on these knives? You know, it's that simple approach to start with, and then we dig deeper. Now, I got to say that uh, as far as legend and lore, uh, we don't know for sure that James Black made the original Bowie knife. Now, we do know that the name come from Jim Bowie, of course. I mean, it's a nickname. It's a name that's now a household word. But we there's no real documentation that of which knife he used in a particular incident. Um, there was other knife makers that were that may have been their primary job, may have been blacksmith. In fact, James Black was a blacksmith, but he also made knives. So there were other people that had a very similar set of circumstances. Um, there's other genre of knives that I'm sure James Black owned more than one knife. Excuse me, Jim Bowie owned more than one knife, and other people own more than one. I do certainly. So it's not a. It wouldn't have been uncommon even back then for for a famous person to own more than one knife and made by different people, different makers. Um, and so it gets confusing when a maker imitates someone else's work. Uh, at some point, when James Black's work became notable, he became copied. His work was copied. So knowing the difference between a copy and his original work, that could be important when it comes to placing value on it. And it's the same with the other categories of knives: Sheffield knives, California knives, and the others we mentioned earlier. Those those all need to be authenticated. And on top of all that, James Black, as with some of the blacksmiths, they didn't mark their work in a normal way of marking with their name. They didn't stamp their name on their work. So uh, it's our Mark Zaleski, myself, and a few others in our group. Uh, it's our job, our goal, and our task to find common features and try to use. Uh, I hesitate to use the term forensics, but look at evidence to see if we can determine if the same hands made this piece as another that looks very similar. Uh, so yeah, it's an ongoing developing skill and science, I guess, if you will, that we're trying to develop, and we're we're making progress, and we're also getting the confidence from some of the museums and from some of the agencies and institutions that own some of these very important historic knives, so, to where we can study them, and so that's very gratifying to know that we're getting their confidence so we can go and observe and handle and study the knives that have spent most of the last 100 years behind glass.
Yeah, and isn't that it's very interesting to me because it's like understand. I get the allure for a museum because you have these historical representations or exhibit items, and they wonder whether they actually have a Rembrandt or whether it's a reproduction. And there's nothing really there currently that to tell whether it came from where it was supposed to or not. And that same concept exists in a lot of other forms of art, but very much less in knives. And I appreciate the work that you guys are doing because I do feel that in whatever capacity you guys are actually able to discover these things, it'll be instrumental in being able to provide some level of provenance for Bowie knives holistically. Obviously a lot easier to tell with Sheffield Bowies because they, being in Sheffield, they had hallmarks and things that gave some like level of origin and time. But for the early Americana of Bowie knives and that era of blade smithing, there's really not a lot of data. So I know that I alluded to this earlier, but there's an actual exhibition that you guys have in the museum up there that showcases Bowie knives as part of Arkansas's history. And I'd like you to be able to talk a little bit more about that and what you guys are doing on you said the 17th of this month in reopening that. Can you talk a little bit more about the museum holistically, the exhibition and everything, and kind of what you guys are doing there?
Yes, the new exhibit is going to stress Arkansas makers. Yet there will be exhibit and information And some of this is going to be new, like in new format. For instance, touch screen um, kiosk, to where you can go and look at the American Bladesmith Society Hall of Fame, find out some of the history of the formation of the American Bladesmith Society. Um, there will be examples of uh, James Black's work. The museum houses three of ones, three knives that are we're certain were made by James Black. One of them is the pivotal knife of his body of work, in that it has provenance, it has written provenance and history uh, that date from that period. So it's pivotal. So you can see that knife being this more or less the center of the of his body of work. That everything else compares to that knife. Uh, but those knives are there in the exhibit. The exhibit takes on a new color scheme that matches the book, the Bowie knife in America, Sure Defense, the Bowie knife in America. Uh, you've probably seen or heard of that book. It was produced by the Historic Arkansas Museum. I think it was in 2014 or 2016. Time is getting by so quick now, I've kind of lost track. But it has a new color theme. It has a new sort of a new upgraded purpose. It's going to stress Arkansas makers, and I'm not talking about just established old guys like myself and Jerry Fisk and J.R. Cook, but there's going to be some of the younger guys that are in Arkansas that are coming on, and some of their work is going to be um, exhibited. Uh, and it's just to show that knife making is still alive. The forged blade is still something that Arkansas is stressing and encouraging, and the teaching still goes on, and the learning still goes on. Um, so it's going to be new. I mean, I haven't seen it myself. It's brand new. So I mean, while I have some input on, they'll ask me questions. They consult with me on some things. I haven't literally laid eyes on the new exhibit yet, so it's going to be all new to me too.
Yeah, I think that'll be pretty exciting, especially on the back of you being awarded the Arkansas Living Treasure Award for 2023, which congratulations, by the way, on that.
Thank you.
Um, can you describe a little bit more about the Arkansas Living Treasure Award and the significance of that?
Yeah. Every year, the Arkansas Arts Council, they try to look at artists around the state of Arkansas, and they uh, invite them uh, to be nominated for the award. And for 2023, uh, I was I was nominated by Peter Bleed and by Tim Richardson. These are my dear friends who uh, thought that they think enough of me and my work and our time together in the blacksmith shop that they went just great effort um, to help me with that. I mean, I left alone, I mean, I'm the kind of person that may or may not uh, go to that kind of effort. But I have them to thank. I do have them to thank. They went to a lot of effort, and of course, I had professional photos of my work. Still got some uh, examples of knives that I have that were available to show to a jury, and and I was selected. And I believe that uh, there were people that do not just pottery, but woodworking and any other craft that is grounded to history. I mean, when you look at all the different crafts that are nominated and apply, um, it's a great honor. It really is a great honor that my making of a knife can be considered an art form and be worthy of that award. It's really humbling and a great honor for me. I really uh, owe them a lot for that.
Yeah. So since 2002, the Arkansas Arts Council has recognized living treasures, and like the breadth of artisans goes from like stained glass to quilts to fiddle making, basket making, pottery, chair making, log cabin construction, egg art. Like we're talking about when it comes to artistry holistically, there's a lot of competition that spans a very wide breadth of potential crafts. And I believe that James Cook received the award in 2007. And what I see here is that over the last what are we talking here? 21 years of awards, bladesmithing has been represented twice, and it's by you and James Cook, and that's it. And that seems to me pretty significant that bladesmithing has received the attention as many times as it has in Arkansas, and I definitely would be proud of that. It seems like in the lexicon of culture that bladesmithing and knife making is being acknowledged is a pretty big deal in being able to push that needle forward.
I agree. I agree. It's a wonderful thing, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it. And I really appreciate the Arts Council and that program for the Arkansas Living Treasure.
Yeah, but that's not the sum total of your accolades either. I mean, I for several years now you've been teaching classes at Blade Show in Atlanta, correct?
I have taught a few classes and did some lectures there in Atlanta. Uh, Primarily, my teaching is centered here in Arkansas. I teach at the University of Arkansas at Hope in Texarkana. Um, I teach here in my own shop. I teach at the New England School of Metalwork and other places, of course. But yeah, it's when it comes to bladesmithing, I kind of get around, I guess.
Yeah. Can you correct me on some history when it comes to the James Black School of bladesmithing or blacksmithing? Like I've seen a decent amount of that come up here and there, but I don't understand when the school is created and its significance in the world of blacksmithing and bladesmithing. Can you talk a little bit more about that for me?
Yeah, the actual school um, property was once housing the American Bladesmith Society, the Bill Moran School of Bladesmithing, and about 2018 or so, 2019, somewhere along in there, um, the American Bladesmith Society moved entirely to the Texarkana College, um, and so the state of Arkansas uh, decided to go ahead and open up this James Black School, uh, which is of historic trades, bladesmithing and historic trades. Um, and so I'm an instructor there. I've got a duck coming through, so excuse excuse that noise.
I well, it's interesting to me. Who would have thought that you could get a more formal education through not just metallurgy or metalworking, but specifically focusing on a craft like bladesmithing, and that to me is really cool. I feel like there's no there's no situation where I feel like in knives that it's like those were the good old days. Like we're living in the good old days. We're living in the epicenter of the resurgence of knives as art. And it's actually interesting to me that there's this there's this other pillar of knives that like some society looks like as weapons. At the same time, it's getting a lot of acknowledgement as art and as utility, like as tool. From a heritage perspective, I'm interested to know how in the future that'll unfold, where as knives become more and more part of this heritage conversation, how legislation and how the public view of knives might change from just being weaponry or banned subjects online to actually embracing their original form and utility.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to say. All I can say is, we treat it as a normal thing here. We talk about it, and we view it as an art form, a point of history, and it's part of Arkansas's history. And right now, it's recognized as such. And we have a festival called the James Black Festival. We've had two of them, and the third one will be in the spring of 2024. And it's where all things James Black and history about knives will be discussed and shown. And everything from a cutting competition to some of the original knives being shown in the historic courthouse um, there in Old Washington, Arkansas, historic Washington, Arkansas. By the way, the entire town is a state park. So most of the structures, buildings, if they're not actually old and historic and refurbished and redone in their original condition, then uh, then they all support the idea of it being a state park. There's offices and administration buildings, and there's a place for us to have a knife show where knife makers can purchase a table and sell their work. It's a full weekend of everything about knives, and it's a wonderful place to go. And you can carry a Bowie knife on your side; no one will think twice about it. Even children. I don't mean to say they have functioning knives; they have wooden mock-up of knives that they give away to children in little balloons shaped like a Bowie knife, cookies shaped like a Bowie knife. We have forging competitions, the cutting competitions. I mean, that's so much fun. By the way, there's going to be a cutting competition Saturday on the 17th. Um, it will be emceed by Jerry Fisk, and there will be, I think, upwards of 12 to 14 contestants. The requirements are that they make their own knife. Of course, safety is paramount, but it's a lot of fun. And you learn a lot from watching and from participating in these competitions.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. Um, I know as we wind down this interview, that I would like to ask kind of my final question, and that's um, I feel like you've already provided a lot of value to makers in the artistry and aesthetic and function of knives, but I have to ask if there's like a single or a few words of advice that you have for the next generation, and maybe ways that they can push themselves or elevate their selves, or things like that. Is there something that for a new maker that you would advise to get to a place where they can kind of start discovering themselves? And do you have any advice for like some of us who've been in the industry for a while?
Yes, the the practical side of things, the financial investment. Invest in yourself. invest in your education. Before you purchase a lot of equipment, invest in yourself with your training. Take classes, take courses, and uh, go to the best that you can uh, afford. Go to the classes with the best instructors, because that's where you're going to learn, uh, and you're going to grow. If you have your own group that you hang out with, that's good. You can compare notes and compare your work. But if that's all you hang out with, you're not going to grow very much. You're going to plateau quick. So always hang out with and learn from people that are a lot better than you, that have more new ideas, more new techniques. Go to those and hang out with those. That's where you're going to learn the most. And don't get bogged down in politics or offended by uh, the things that are common to groups and to different clubs. But just go to the best and learn from them, and invest in yourself. Those are the things that I would advise.
Well, yeah, and I think that applies to everyone, right? Because even I think that I've learned knives in such isolation that now I really think more about introducing myself to the mentorship of other makers and actually going to their shops or going to classes and trying to rediscover different ways to make knives and to push myself. But I don't know if I don't know if I knew what kind of questions to ask until now. Even 7 years in, it's like this knives are kind of like confusing to me because it's one of those areas that there are so many sub niches of focus that I really don't know if I knew what questions to ask and what avenue to go down until even now. And so for me, I'm actually interested in kind of curating my education more and being able to find those around me that I really want to pursue this kind of work versus that. So I think the earlier you can figure out what direction you want to take, the easier it is to decide on what kind of education you think that you'll need to accomplish that goal. So don't spend 7 years like me fiddling around with knives before you decide on what kind of direction you want to take. The earlier you can figure that out, the more effective you'll be in being able to find people to educate you, I assume.
That's right. At first, you can't help but imitate others. So you have no foundation, but that will be your foundation. And sooner or later, hopefully sooner, you'll develop your own taste and style, and start to actually create something that's uniquely yours, that is recognized as being yours and yours alone.
Well, I really appreciate those words of advice, and I really appreciate your extended time being able to talk to me and just allow me to pick your brain. It's been an absolute pleasure, and for anybody who is interested in Lin's work, look online. He's represented in many different websites, and you can meet him in person and talk to him. He's a really cool guy. And Lin, again, thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, Aaron. I wish everybody the best, and I hope to see you soon.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.